So welcome, Dr. Michael Leahy and Dr. Peter Wilkinson.
Thank you.
I'm going to introduce Michael first, and then I'm going to pass it over to him. Michael was born in Sydney in 1944. He was raised in Melbourne, where he completed his primary and secondary education. He attended St. Kevin's Parish School before gaining an Archdiocesan scholarship to St. Thomas More's School in 1957, and subsequently to the Christian Brothers College, East St. Kilda. After matriculating from there in 1961, in 62, Michael entered Corpus Christi College, Werribee, the seminary serving the Diocese of Victoria in Tasmania, in the preparation of students for the priesthood. On completion of the 4-year course in philosophy and humanities there, he was sent to the Pontifical Urban College, Rome, for the 4-year theological course. In 1969, he graduated from the Pontifical Urban University with a licentiate in secret theology, magna cum laude, and returned to Melbourne for priestly ordination. There, over a period of 4 years, he served as an assistant priest in 3 different parishes. In 1973, he left the ministry and taught first for many years in secondary schools and subsequently in teacher training institutions. From 1986 to 1988, Michael was employed by the Catholic Adult and Tertiary Education Institute of Western Australia to lecture in religious education in the Western Australian College of Advanced Education, which is now known as Edith Cowan University in Perth. Later, he filled a similar position at State College of Victoria, Christ Campus. When the Hawke's government reforms to tertiary education virtually abolished philosophy and education from the teaching training core curriculum, Michael, holding a PhD in educational philosophy, had to reinvent himself, as we often do, and along with his colleagues in that profession, as something else. So he did a second PhD, completing a second doctorate, this time in political philosophy. So he's PhD. And he taught in this area and in political science at Deakin University, Victoria, until his retirement in 2013. Michael married Pat in 1974, and in 2024, they have 3 children, Naomi, Miriam, and Greg, and 7 grandchildren. He now lives in the beach resort of Ocean Grove, Victoria, which is a gorgeous place in Australia. So, Michael, without further ado, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Murray, and thank you for inviting me to deliver a paper at this very important conference. A conference whose importance has been underlined just today by events that have taken place here. The National Redress Scheme set up on the recommendation of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse has awarded compensation to 2 people who claimed to be victims of the late Cardinal George Pell. I have sent a long article by Louise Milligan, who is distinguished journalist here, on this matter to Murray, and hopefully you'll get the chance to read that and perhaps circulate it all the more widely. But this topic is not just dear to my heart, but it is the more urgent because of the fact that the efforts to suppress the importance of the Pell case by his supporters have been so successful to this point. But by today's events, they have been exposed as very dubious indeed. So I preface my presentation with those remarks. My paper is titled Getting to the Root of the Evil, Reforming the Church Culture Underlying Clerical Child Sexual Abuse. And by way of introduction, I approach this topic from an unusual, if not unique, vantage point, that of a victim and also of a former priest of the abusing institution.
Michael, may I just stop you there for a second? Is this the first time you have publicly acknowledged that you are a victim?
It is in this kind of forum, yes. My book was published yesterday.
Oh, wonderful.
So in that sense, I came out yesterday. But anyway, to continue, this vantage point gives me an enhanced ability to distinguish commitments to reform that, though necessary, are superficial, and commitments that go to the roots of the evil of child sexual abuse in the institutional culture of the Catholic Church. Superficial reforms, in my view, include the rules and structures governing professional conduct and supervision of clerics and procedures for lodging complaints about their behaviours, which curtail the opportunities for clerical abuse and their ability to escape accountability for it. However, unless the underlying culture is also reformed, the other conditions facilitating the development and expression of this paedophiliac pathology remain unaddressed. So the pathology will find other ways of expressing itself. This culture, according to the Australian Royal Commission, includes a combination of theological, historical, cultural, and structural or organisational factors in the Catholic Church. Here I'm quoting the Royal Commission. In what follows, I try to address these roots in the light of my own experience of abuse and my subsequent experience of dealing with its effects in the terms of my own faith development. While I express some strong views about church structures, personnel, and practices, I do so not out of any bitterness flowing from my own experience. I have always found harbouring such bitterness a pointless and self-defeating exercise. Rather, my hope is that the strength of my judgments may shake some in the church, in particular the hierarchy, into taking this crisis more seriously and committing themselves to the radical reforms necessary to address its cultural roots effectively. These cultural roots, I contend, remain largely unaddressed because they go to the lingering attachment of the institution to the static world view, which Vatican II declared superseded, and to the reformed understanding of church and priesthood required if the church is to fulfill its mission as the sign of God's salvation to the world. The use of children by some clergy for the gratification of their own sexual desires, I submit, is rooted in the understanding of the status conferred on them by a self-serving church. I developed my case for this view from its foundations in my own experience. Now, here under the heading of not just a bad apple, the argument that we've heard so often from the hierarchy, I turn my attention to the practices and general ethos that prevailed within the church in the time that my abuse took place. My abuse occurred because of the institutional factors operating at the time, which facilitated the indulgence of my abusers personal pathology. His name was Tom Jones. Factors including the following. Priests had open entry to Catholic schools in the 40s and 50s. These schools provided initiation to sacraments of First Communion, Confirmation, and regular First Friday confession. The school was also the recruiting ground for altar boys who were rostered for regular service and could be called out of class for funeral service. Because of his sacramental powers and celibate state, the priest was seen as holier than other church members and thus enjoyed an almost unchallengeable authority. These were the factors embedded in the ethos and practices of the church in this era, which not only made access to potential victims almost unimpeded, but also groomed parents and teachers to interpret certain clerical behaviours which should have raised suspicions as exempt from suspicion. Now, I turn my attention here to some particular doctrines and disciplines within that ethos. As well as this general ethos and the practices that followed from it, there were also particular doctrines and disciplines which reinforced the power of that ethos and those practices. The doctrine of original sin, according to which all humankind somehow inherited the guilt of our first parents, Adam and Eve, and the consequent loss of original innocence or perfection, thus alienating them from God and eternal salvation. In his mercy, according to this theological position, God chose to redeem humankind by sending his own son as a human being to die on the cross for them, so that by believing in him and being baptized in his name, they might regain the favour of God and be saved from eternal damnation. On this theology, the work of preaching this message and administering the saving grace of baptism and the other sacraments on earth was entrusted by Christ to his church, a hierarchical structure headed by the Bishop of Rome, who became known as the Pope. Even the baptized were capable of falling back into sin because human nature, according to this theology, had been weakened by original sin. The sacrament of penance or confession was therefore necessary to enable these fallen members to regain the state of grace. Indeed, according to this theology, original sin had also clouded the human understanding of the dictates of the moral law inscribed by the Creator on human nature. And so humans depended for the correct understanding of that law on its authoritative interpretation by Christ's church. Interpretation of the natural law was the job of the hierarchy, especially the Pope, but its enforcement was the task of their local police, namely the priests, especially those in parishes. To have this authority to bind or loose human beings from their sins, priests had to be raised to a higher state of being. This was accomplished by the sacrament of holy orders, which wrought in them and I quote, ontological change. This ontological change empowered them to act in the place of Christ, in the preaching of his word and the administration of his sacraments. In the case of the sacrament of penance, it authorized the priest to judge penitents for their violations of the natural law, to impose penances in atonement, and to grant or withhold absolution from guilt for those offences. Since in confessing their sins to the priest, penitents were in fact, on this doctrine, confessing them to God, the content of those confessions was inviolably confidential. The seal of confession forbade the priest from disclosing their content under any circumstances. But if this sacrament was to be effective in keeping the faithful educated in their understanding of sin and protected from falling into it or rescued when they did, attendance at the sacrament had to be regular, and this required disciplines such as the 9 First Friday observances. I suspect they prevailed not only in Australia. According to the Church's natural law-based moral theology, any violation of that law in relation to sexual acts was a mortal sin. If the role of the priest was indispensable for obtaining absolution from such damnable acts, it was of comparable importance in counselling to overcome the habit of falling into them. The status of the priest made his authority and his behaviour almost unchallengeable. Since this was the theology in which all priests of that time were formed, exposure of its flaws is therefore indispensable to their reform and to the eradication of their evil effects. Now, here I turn to the fatal flaws in these theological assumptions and therefore in the disciplines and practices just outlined to which they gave rise. These theological assumptions were based on a static view of the world. On this view, the world was created more or less in a single act or set of acts as recounted in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Its nature, and thus human nature as part of it, was therefore fixed from the beginning and was changed only in the sense that it was weakened by the sin of Adam and Eve. Divine intervention was thus necessary to rescue humankind from the eternal damnation that inheritance of the consequences of this sin brought upon it. The merits of Christ's self-sacrifice on the cross accomplished that rescue, and these merits were distributed by his church. But on this static vision, their reception is conditional upon humankind's obedience to the natural law. Having been weakened in their power to read that law by the effect of original sin, humankind now depends for the correct interpretation of that law upon the teaching of the church.
So, Michael, that's the static view you've just expressed, correct?
And what I'm going to go on to now is the discrediting of that view in the light of the evolutionary worldview that superseded it.
Thank you.
Scientific research has totally discredited this static view of the origins of the universe and of humankind as part of it. The church itself, in fact, repudiated this static view in favour of the evolutionary one in Vatican II's Constitution on the Church Today, paragraph 5, and I quote, "Thus, the human race has passed from a rather static view of reality to a more dynamic, evolutionary one. In consequence, there has arisen a new series of problems, a series as important as can be, calling for new efforts of analysis and synthesis. End of quotation. One consequence of acceptance of this evolutionary view of the origins of the universe and of humankind is that the traditional theology of original sin and the theology of redemption based on it is no longer credible. There could have been no original state of innocence, and therefore no fall from it, which humankind would need rescue from. Christ's death could no longer be understood as a sacrifice of atonement for an original sin. And the theory of the church as the custodian of the merits of that death is also accordingly discredited. So too is the notion that natural law is something fixed and unchanging and capable of being correctly interpreted only by a divinely appointed and enlightened authority. The enlightening spirit the church itself has always taught is given to the whole church, and indeed flows where it wills throughout the whole creation, and not just to the hierarchy. Personal sin on the evolutionary vision is to be understood fundamentally as human resistance to God's solicitation to accept the gift of God's creative spirit. This spirit empowers humans to cooperate in bringing the evolutionary process to its culmination in a human community united in the love of God. Because evolution, in all its aspects, is by definition a movement from some imperfect or incomplete state to a state of perfection or completion, there will be failures, shortfalls, regresses in that movement until the final state is reached. The Spirit's gift is the gift of the power to love, to share in the life of Father, Son, and Spirit, which is a life of love. So all sin is a failure to meet the demands of love in one's particular situation. Conversely, human perfection consists in the achievement of the ability to govern one's entire life by the demands of love. This is the significance of Christ's death on the cross, his refusal to cease loving, even when put to death. Christ's openness to the love of God admitted the gift of the Spirit to his person in such a way that physical death had no effect on his inmost life. Christ, enlivened by the power of love, became the firstborn of God's new creation, and his admittance of the Spirit to humanity makes it possible for all humanity to receive the gift of his risen life. The insight of the biblical authors that humankind was somehow alienated from the good God who had created the world good is thus subsumed into a theology that is better illuminated by the modern evolutionary worldview. Within that evolutionary worldview, it is absurd to think that God could be illuminating human nature and its destiny with all the moral implications entailed through his revelation to a single earthly institution, especially one so recently arrived in human history. Within the evolutionary worldview, the Church's understanding of God's revelation and its own authority to teach on faith and morals are in need of drastic revision. Viewed within the evolutionary perspective, the claims made for hierarchical authority to interpret the natural moral law suffer the same fate as the doctrine of original sin on which they rest. Firstly, the claim is too vast in its application. The idea that a single institution could be the recipient of sufficient divine enlightenment to be the authoritative interpreter of a law inscribed by definition on the natures of all human beings sounds ridiculously pretentious and quite naive, considering the vastness of the mysteries of the creation that evolutionary science is revealing to us. Secondly, the claim is too exclusive in its pretended access to its source. The source of enlightenment on the natural moral law, as on matters of faith, is the Holy Spirit. But the Church acknowledges in its own teaching that the Spirit of truth is given to the whole community. It is thus carrying this absurdity to bizarre lengths to set up the kind of teaching and disciplinary apparatus for enforcing these doctrines and disciplines that we have seen in the past, remnants of which persist in the present. The notion of ontological change, which the static version applied to the priesthood, stemmed from a long superseded neo-Aristotelian conception of the world as composed of matter and form, essences and accidents or appearances. The evolutionary vision saw the presence of the divine as emerging in the human becoming divine by voluntarily opening itself to the latter's transforming power within the human. Whatever the ministry to which those known as priests are called in the Church, they can no longer be credibly conceived as ontologically changed persons as a result of the sacrament of holy orders. Indeed, once again, the biblical evidence shows that the prevailing sacerdotal conception of priesthood, as the modern scholarship terms it, stems not from an understanding of the mysteries spawned by the primitive church, but from Plato, a pagan philosopher. The New Testament speaks more of presbyters and episcopoi, elders and supervisors, whose task was to lead the community in faith by the ministry of the word. Both the idea of a church divinely empowered to discern the demands of the so-called natural moral law and of priests also divinely authorized to police their observance in a divinely instituted sacrament are hard to reconcile with the vision of the world as engaged in a process of evolution in which humans are striving to develop their understanding of that world and respond adequately to its moral demands. The unique offering that the Church has to make to the world is its discernment, rather, of a divine presence at work in the evolutionary process and thus in human history. The power of that presence, according to this insight, is the power of love. And it is in this power that humankind is invited to share, and by doing so, become collaborators with this divine power in building the human race into a community of love, thus bringing the creation to its culmination. Love can possess no other power than itself, and indeed has no need of any other power. The insight that the Christian community brings to the debate of moral issues is about the demands of love. Indeed, that community must be driven to contribute to such debates by this demand, and to the execution of this demand in relation to situations of injustice, of neglected needs, of denial of dignity. Rather than lord it over the world in the name of divine authority, the church should be humbly accompanying people in their search for the love which, in the words of Vatican II's Constitution on the Church today, paragraph 1, alone can fulfill, and I quote, their joys and hopes and assuage their griefs and anxieties. Now, my argument is that abuse within the church was spawned by the concentration by the church of power in a particular caste. That's what I go on to here. A key feature of the malaise of child sexual abuse is its concentration of power in the hands of a particular caste, an all-male, celibate hierarchy. Each of these features contributes to the conditions that facilitate clerical sexual abuse of children. The caste is a caste because it is, by definition, a group set aside for a particular role in the church, a role entailing certain powers and privileges. Because the caste is all male by decree of the hierarchy, that same decree declares an inequality between men and women in the church. Because in the Western rite of the church, the most powerful one, priests are required to be celibate. This caste embodies the hierarchy's inability to accept women as equals and to integrate sexuality and sexual relationships as part of their understanding of what it means to be human. Because the caste is hierarchical, it distributes power according to rank, thus depriving men in the lower ranks, but nonetheless men endowed with sacramental powers by ordination, of real control over their own consciences and even over the details of their own lives, where they live and work, whom they work with, for how long, what kind of work or study they do. Power is thus accompanied in these lower members of the caste by powerlessness. This poses problems for these men. In a context where priests were neither trained to recognise the limits of their own professional authority, nor supervised in respecting them, some of them used children as receptors of their own needs and carried on with their public ministries unchallenged. Distinguished Irish researcher Marie Keenan writes, and I quote, "I have come to the following conclusion. Their experiences of powerlessness in the private sphere, combined with their idea of power as accountability upwards, were devoid of facilitated introspection, as they were left unsupervised, unsupported, and unchallenged to minister in a site of unregulated public power." End of quotation. Referring to the theology of the priest as ontologically changed, Keenan also wrote, and I quote her again, "Influenced by this theology of priesthood, it is little wonder that priesthood was construed by clergy and laity alike as a personal gift and a permanent sacred calling, rather than a gift of service to the community." End of quotation. My abuser, Jones, was a classic example of the phenomena identified by Keenan. Acutely jealous of his status as a priest, at the same time he felt powerless within the priesthood. He survived in the ministry as long as he did only because successive bishops colluded in keeping complaints against him secret. If exposure had begun in the 80s or earlier, Jones would have been convicted and sentenced like Ridsdale, Gannon, and others amongst his clerical contemporaries were. Jones's victims have been denied this form of justice by his death. However, some have sought or are now seeking justice through the National Redress Scheme or through civil suits against the Church. The way the Church is responding to these suits is nothing short of scandalous in the full evangelical sense of that term, namely posing a stumbling block to faith in the gospel. Now, here I turn my attention to the Catholic Church's response to victims, which I updated with the news about the Pell cases at the opening of my address.
Yes.
In my view, the current treatment of civil claims for compensation by the Church amounts to failures in faith on its part. Faith, according to Vatican II, means entrusting oneself totally to the God who reveals himself to us. So says Dei Verbum number 5 of Vatican II. Faith's flip side is love. One cannot genuinely entrust oneself totally to God if one withholds love from others. Rather than offering love in the form of pastoral care and just compensation, the Church is engaging in risk management and asset preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Invocation of institutional rights, like so-called legal rights, such as the Church is not the employer of its priests, as Bishop Paul Bird of Ballarat seems to have successfully argued before the High Court in the Brian Coffey matter, are so much sophistry in the face of the suffering of victims. Bankruptcy should be recognised for what it is, a form of asset preservation. Christ's call to go sell what you have and give the proceeds to the poor, then come follow me, demands that you preserve nothing if you want to follow him. In its response to victims of child sexual abuse, therefore, the church is faced with a choice between trusting in Christ and trusting in institutional assets. For me, the sincerity of the condemnations of the crimes and apologies to the victims by successive popes and prefects of Vatican dicasteries is called into question when the structures and procedures they set up to respond to the crisis are never truly victim-centred. The real centres of their concerns can be seen from the following examples. One, the Church's insistence on secrecy in relation even to canon law relating to child sexual abuse is clearly institution-centred. Its invocation, as the late Cardinal Dulles did, of the indelible character, quote unquote, of a pedophile priest's consecration in support of a claimed right to protection from the penalty of permanent exclusion from ministry against the weight of psychiatric opinion is clearly also priest-centred. 3, its scapegoating of homosexuality and secularisation are also resistances of institutional responsibility for crimes that are evidently systematic in character. 4, the resignations of victims, but also of committed bureaucrats from the Commission for the Protection of Minors betray similar doubts about the victim-centredness of Pope Francis's own efforts at reform. Now, here I want to go on to suggest a way of reframing the issue of permanent exclusion from ministry that removes its basis in a rights claim. I referred to the rights claimed in point 2 of the list that I just mentioned. The right claimed in 2 is the right of an accused priest to a just punishment for the crime of which a canonical procedure has convicted him. The claim is that permanent exclusion from ministry is an unjust punishment because it denies the tribunal the power to fit the punishment to the circumstances of particular cases. But if the canonical penalties for crimes of sexual abuses against minors did not include exclusion from ministry, the question of excluding the relevant priests from ministry could not be framed in terms of their rights under these laws. Removal of this basis of the claimed right would thus enable consideration of exclusion from ministry on its proper basis, namely the continuing fitness of the relevant priest for ministry, whether he is still capable of preaching the word and bearing witness to that word in his own life. Now, if that's the issue, fitness for ministry, the weight of the psychiatric evidence would have to be overwhelming in this day and age. And the question of the right of a priest would not even arise, because here the competence of the particular tribunal involved would not be to adjudicate on the matter of an ecclesiastical charge against the relevant priest, but only on his fitness for ministry. So I think that in fact is the way that we ought to go here. The vision of a synodal church offers some hope of reform. However, if synodality means walking together as a church, that phrase is worse than meaningless if it means that the cries of victims are to be met with admonitions of patience or excuses like the need to protect the privacy of unnamed parties. By way of conclusion, it is a refusal to read the signs of our times that has allowed the church to wallow in the comfort of what it misnames tradition, instead of embarking upon the risky journey of reform enjoined by Vatican II. An understanding of church which idolizes its hierarchical structure in a manner in some ways akin to that in which the Romans idolized their emperors, has borne its fruits in an enslaved laity and priesthood, the latter significantly, though far from universally, corrupted by the temptation to seek power instead through sexual crimes against children. Lay people, dragged into the adult exercise of conscience by the impossible demands of Humanae Vitae, the papal encyclical of 1967 on birth control, have outgrown the understanding of church which permitted their former enslavement. For so many clergy and laity, this self-serving model of church is exposed as incompatible with the model of the church as the sacrament of salvation to the world. The latter model is the one genuinely founded in the tradition of the church and proclaimed as such by Vatican II in paragraph 1 of Lumen Gentium. The attempt to continue to bind the minds of the faithful to the static vision of the world and to its accompanying versions of the doctrines of original sin and redemption is an attempt at continuing infantilization of the faithful's understanding of the great mysteries of human existence. The clinging to institutional power expressed in such attempts and in the doctrines of the church and priesthood to which they lead is the giveaway of their human rather than divine foundation. The refusal to acknowledge its long-held fear of sex and sexuality, particularly women's sexuality, continues to bedevil the church's attempts at teaching sexual morality and to erode its general credibility on moral questions. Compulsory priestly celibacy is consistent with this fear. Its defences so often lack any recognition of the goodness of sexual relationships, the virtues of lovemaking. By clinging to a medieval understanding of the morality of sexual acts, it methodologically blocks out the possibility of acknowledging that genuine love may be expressed in homosexual relationships. If the exclusion of the possibility of reproduction from sex between homosexuals renders such sex immoral, one is left with the absurd consequence that the absence of such a possibility in postmenopausal or sterile couples must also be immoral. This is the cultural context which gave rise to the ethos of clericalism, which enabled shepherds to sexually abuse their lambs instead of feeding them as Jesus commanded. Thank you for your attention.
Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to before I thank you very much, Michael. Before I hand you over to the open forum here, I'd invite Dr. Peter Wilkinson and Gail Grossman-Frayne to perhaps comment upon what you've just said. Peter, would you like to start?
Asked you to unmute.
Oh, you have to unmute, Peter.
You have to unmute, yeah.
You're muted, Peter.
Just unmute.
Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep, can do.
Thank you, Michael, for an extraordinary presentation. And I think what you have just said opens up this summit forum to some very, very deep thinking that I particularly welcome. And I hope that your own experience will bring to this meeting some challenges, but also some extraordinary opportunities. Thank you, Murray.
Thank you very much, Peter. Gail, would you like to weigh in? I think you're muted. Yeah, you're muted, Gail.
Wait, I'm here.
But you're good. Yeah, got you.
I've done it.
Can I just say before you start speaking, Gail, that Gail Grossman-Frayne will be a guest in this room on day 3. So she has a lot of wonderful things to say about love and a reimagining, just as we have heard from Michael Leahy in his rejection of original sin, the reasons for redemption, the nature of priesthood, the power of the Holy Spirit. So Gail, please go ahead.
Well, I think, yeah, thank you, Michael. I think that was an extraordinary presentation. I learn from you every time, and this time was no example. Nothing different. I mean, I think the big thing that struck me as you were talking there was the movement from a static to an evolutionary understanding, and I think that has huge ramifications, which you mentioned. I mean, an awful lot of them about about Christ's death on the cross and atonement, and that most importantly, perhaps, that the natural law is not fixed. There's an awful lot to be teased out in your presentation, Michael. I'm very grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you. And may I say I'm going to hand it over to an open forum, but can I say, Michael, that the depth of your theological thinking will have a few heads spinning in this room. So I have Michael's full lecture, which I can provide to you as after the event, because it's very hard to keep a lot of these notions in your head because they're so, in many minds here, revolutionary. But we're talking about one of the great thinkers on this planet, and Dr. Michael Leahy is one of them. So I'm going to hand over to open forum now, Michael. So any person that's got questions to put to Michael might like to come forward. Looks like you've stunned them with your brilliance, Michael. Hold on.
Oh. I hope it was brilliant and not something else.
No. Yes. Please. Okay. Yeah, we have Leanne Salek stepping up, and I'm not sure which microphone should she go to. This one here. Can then you be on? You take my spot. They'll see you. Here she is.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I'm a lay missionary, so I did take some offense at the question of church teaching, but I'm used to putting up a fight. Let's see. So I guess the main thing I want to talk about is you're saying that it's an arrogant thing of the church to believe it's one institution that, through which Christ or God transmits himself to the world. And I think in the language of John Paul II, he said, all religions have an element of truth, but the fullness of truth is in the church. And that ties into the teaching on sexuality, the theology of the body of John Paul II. That's a really long conversation to have, but I wanted to I don't know if you're familiar with that. Have you read the theology of the body?
I'm familiar with that thought, yes.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a reflection of John Paul II's struggle to reconcile. I'm getting feedback here. Is there something going wrong?
I think we'll put something on mute.
I just moved. Is that muted? Mute.
Okay.
Okay, maybe try again.
Yeah, okay. Again, I'm not getting any feedback as I speak at the moment, so I assume the problem has been solved. Okay, I think it's a reflection of Pope John Paul II's own struggle to reconcile the claims of the static vision of the world and the theology based on it, which was superseded by Vatican II, with the evolutionary vision, which was mandated by Vatican II. Now, that's not surprising. The entire church, the entire world, in a shift from what T.S. Kuhn, the late philosopher and historian of science, described as a paradigm shift. It's characteristic of paradigm shifts that the transition from one to the other is never accomplished in toto in one move. One constantly finds oneself, even though one's had a conversion to the basis of the new paradigm, hearkening back instinctively to elements of the old one. And sometimes this is even unconscious. And so the conversion process is one that takes time, and depending upon the complexity of the paradigm, takes a great deal of reflection, and it's not something that can be accomplished on one's own. So the Pope, I think, was reflecting to a large degree the struggle that a wider element within the church was having to come to terms with the new vision proposed by Vatican II. Now, what I said about the changes in the understanding of the natural moral law goes to what you were talking about in relation to the body. The understanding of the functions of the body, the understanding of the place of the body within the evolutionary process of development to which we are called and into which we are being led by the Holy Spirit. That has to evolve too. We cannot simply deduce moral consequences from our biology as Humane Vitae did. We cannot
sorry to interrupt, but there's the distinction called total gift of self, whether through the vocation of marriage or single life or consecrated life. And that's the sexuality supposed to be channeled towards that for those who are called to single blessedness. That's the teaching, right? And I think the foundation of the theology of the body is that family, being the basic unit of society, stands, the sexuality for married couples has two foundations, they're inseparable from each other, unity and procreation, right? And
No.
those are what's so funny?
Well, I mean, if this is the traditional moral theology, and if you structure those two things hierarchically, then you end up with Humane Vitae. Now, I think that was the error, that you end up with untenable moral consequences if you do establish a priority between those two things.
It's just that I think the heart of that teaching is that it's, it makes sense that it's a strong foundation for marriage, right?
Well, what is the strong foundation for marriage? The total giving?
The marital act be open to life, and that it be for the unity of the, the premise of the theology of the body is that family is the basic unit of society, and what constitutes, I see sister shaking her head, sorry, we're not going to end, we're never going to end here. I could talk for 2 days or 3. So maybe we'll just agree to disagree for now. Sorry, I wanted to know, sexuality is a very important question. And, they say the gospel is supposed to conform the world to Christ, not to conform itself to the world.
Well, Christ didn't talk about the ends of marriage in the terms of the priority that you're giving it. And that theology of the body didn't come from Christ. That came from medieval conceptions of the
17, where he said there's many things I want to tell you, but you can't bear to hear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he revealed these to you. So, there's ongoing revelation based on what we can stomach.
So I didn't follow you there.
John 17. There are many things I want to tell you now, but you cannot bear to hear them. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will reveal these things to you. He will not be speaking of his own accord. He'll be speaking of the one who sent him. Purity of heart, total self-gift, purification.
Yes, but the application you're giving them has its foundations in a medieval philosophy. I mean, okay, look, in the Middle Ages, the best the church could do in understanding what the Spirit was leading us into was expressed in the terms of that philosophy, because they were the thought forms of the day. But we're not dwelling in the Middle Ages. The Spirit has leads us throughout the history in its entirety. And in the present day, medieval philosophical ideas, medieval moral ideas, medieval understanding, the concept of natural law is a medieval idea. Those things are not the things that the Spirit is leading us into today. The Spirit doesn't bind us to the past. The Spirit calls us into the future. That's what Vatican II did. That's what Vatican II did, calling us into the evolution.
Poverty, chastity, and obedience. But anyway, so some things don't change, right? Like virtues are supposed to be timeless and eternal.
Oh, well, I mean, that's too big a generalization. That's a contestable claim.
I mean, I understand the wounds are very deep from priest to priest.
Virtue is a Greek philosophical concept.
But
It's
Christ
not a
is,
gospel one.
I guess the fundamental question is Christ the way, the truth, and the life? And what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a different thing from talking about virtues.
I mean, following him leads to a virtue, right?
No, not necessarily at all. That's a way of life prescribed by Greek philosophers rather than the gospel.
Well, I think the foundation here is still whether Christ is God or not, and what it means to follow him, right?
Oh, it means definitely means following Christ, yes. But what you talk of in terms of virtues has its origins among the Greek philosophers. It's not. That was a concept available in the thought world of the Middle Ages, made available by the reintroduction to the Western theology of Greek philosophical concepts. It was the best Aquinas and the church at that time could do in its job of interpreting the meaning of the gospel in the thought forms of its day. And even the thought forms of its day were those that it drew from a much earlier history in Greek philosophy. So in this day and age, we have to, we look back upon the things, the heritage that view of things tried to express, but we have to try and re-express it in the thought forms of our day. Okay, so, and we have to recognize that some of the thought forms that are still being trotted out in the way that you did there do belong to an ancient past, and that they do not stem from the New Testament for the most part, that they stem from a Greek and medieval history. We have to come to terms with the historicity of our church.
We have 4 minutes to go, so I'm not going to stay here much longer, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that. Anyone else like to comment upon Michael's paper and his position that he's expressed? You can see the argument that we've just had in relationship to the static view versus the evolutionary view of this theology, and the rejection of original sin, the notion that Eve is the reason that we were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. This is the static view of the church. The evolutionary view of the church is quite different. And the way that Michael has expressed it, he moves to the triune God with the Holy Spirit being dominant. and putting your trust in faith and belief in the power of the Holy Spirit, and a willingness to give up everything and to allow yourself to be one with this love, this movement, this tendency, this evolutionary development of love. Would that be a fair comment, Michael?
Yes, I mean, the evolutionary view sees the Holy Spirit as driving the whole of creation and us within it towards a goal, an end, a culmination, which, yes, is, and the power of the Spirit is the power of love. So you've summed it up there. Yes, that's exactly right.
Thank you. So, and the other aspect here that Leanne is getting to is the notion of sexuality, and the notion that this is a imagining of what human sexuality should be, and rather than a thing of shame and a thing of a sin, it is not. It needs to be revisited and seen in terms of love, not as a mortal sin or as that makes us in danger of failure.
It was more a question of the Creator's purpose for it. The Creator's purpose for sexuality.
Yeah, the Creator's purpose for sexuality.
Yeah.
That's the point that you're trying to make here.
Yeah.
I didn't hear that.
No, so Leanne said that it's the purpose of sexuality. Why would the Creator give us a sexual nature?
What's it for? What's the purpose?
Yeah, what's its purpose? What's the purpose of having a sexual drive as a human being?
Oh, that, yes. I mean, obviously, there is a purpose in our possessing of sexuality, but it can't be narrowed down in the way that the paradigm used by Humane Vitae did to a conception on which there are the natural ends that she spelt out there, and that there was a priority between them, and the reproductive one was the primary one, which was what that encyclical argued. That is a trivializing of what human sexuality is about. Human sexuality is, of course, the capacity that they're endowed with that enables them to love above all, especially at the human level. I mean, to give priority to its reproductive function is to reduce it to the animal level. And we as human beings, and as the culmination of the creation, are called to exercise the capacities that we have within us under the terms of the demands of love. And the mechanical sorts of attempt at defining moral law in relation to sexuality that were expressed in documents such as Humane Vitae urge simply in that way, that they were too narrow in their conception of what the purpose of human sexuality was.
All right, so we have to wrap up before we get kicked out of this room.
That's the other
Sorry?
Can I 1 minute? Promise. 1 minute.
All right, so one more comment from Leanne, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry to be militant. There's the total gift of self that the sexuality is supposed to be channeled into giving oneself fully to community or to others. That single blessedness. That's the other goal. That I felt only half of the equation was being represented. So the other option for consecrator single blessedness is to give
So
oneself.
homosexuals, therefore, are engaging morally in giving themselves totally to each other.
Is there a difference between love and lust?
Oh, who says that? Who says there can't be genuine love between homosexuals?
Well, there's the distinction of love versus lust. That's all. I'm sorry.
But that's your definition. Isn't that arbitrary?
Just saying, just to be complete. There's this total self-gift. That's what the other side of the equation is.
It can be a total self-gift between homosexuals. It can be total self-gift.
Okay.
Thank you very much. A vigorous conversation, which is the beauty of this summit.
Indeed.
We're not here to bury anybody's views or to ridicule anybody. We're here to discuss this in an open, transparent, and honest manner, and respectful. So thank you very much, Michael. It's been a great pleasure hosting you. Gail, we look forward to seeing you in a couple of days. Michael, I want to applaud your courage. You understand. How old are you, Michael?
80.
When were you abused, Michael? How old were you when you were abused by the priest?
About the age about 10 or 11.
So 70 years. He's
Yep.
kept this secret or this horror to himself, and this today, before you all, he's revealed his the fact that he was attacked. What kind of courage does that take?
Thank you for the acknowledgement, Murray. I appreciate it very deeply, and I appreciate the invitation to speak to you on such a topic that's so dear to my heart.
And because there's so much deep thought here, a lot of you will have missed a bit of it. With your permission, I'll share your lecture with the people assembled here so that they can reflect on it at leisure. Would you like that? All right. So everybody would like to say thank you to you, Michael. I look forward to seeing you. Peter, thank you very much, brother, for your contribution. And we're going to eat some lovely Filipino food, and we're going to have a banquet after that. And while eating, we'll be thinking about you guys. So thank you very much.
Bon appetit.
Murray, can we tune in tomorrow morning?
We're trying to work out a live feed. We're having issues, but anything that is a Google Meet, you can be part of.
Right. So,
what we're doing, Peter, is we're videographing the whole thing. There will be a complete coverage of everything here with photos for all the days, which we will get to share with you.
Can we use the link that you sent us to tune in tomorrow?
Yeah. Well, no, I'll reconnect.
Manila AM time.
See how it works. I'm 74 in a couple of days. I'm younger than you. I'm a spring chicken compared to you, but we'll see how we can get the technology working, Peter.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Remember, I'm in New Zealand. I'm not as smart as you Aussies. All right. See you guys. Bye, man.
I didn't get a link today, so it'd be great to get one for tomorrow.
All right. Okay. See ya.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.